Hi, welcome to the part 2 of SpringBoot tips series. In this video, we are going to learn how to manage application configuration in the right way. I know there is no one right way, but we are going to look at some tips and techniques of how to configure the application and how to consume those values from the application and how to make sure we haven't configured invalid values, how to validate them. If we take any non-trivial application, then there is a high chance that we need some kind of a configuration that differs from environment to environment. Let us say we want to deploy our application in dev, staging, production environments, and we want to talk to different services like databases. So the configuration differs from environment to environment. So to handle these kind of scenarios, Spring Boot provides a lot of options how to feed those external configuration to the application. Let us take a quick look at what are all the options Spring Boot provides. If we go to Spring Boot official documentation and under core features, there is a section called externalized configuration. So if we take a glance at it, there are almost 14 types of options that you can feed these configuration to the application. And even more interesting is if you dig through all these features further down in the documentation, you will get to know that there are more variations of it and there are so many options that you can provide these configuration parameter values to the application. But in my experience, just because providing these all types of options doesn't mean you should be using them. In my experience, there are mainly three options that you could use, and it is going to be enough for most of the cases. If you are ever worked with the Spring Boot application, you know that we can configure the properties in application.properties file, which contains default values, and you can have profile specific properties files like application hyphen profile name, such as application hyphen dev.properties, application hyphen qa.properties, things like that. And finally, while running the application, sometimes you may have to provide some dynamic configuration values. So the best option is to use environment variables to override any of the default values or profile specific values. We can use environment variables to override all of them. So environment variables are going to take highest priority. So these three options are more than sufficient for 99% of the application unless you have some weird requirements. Okay, let us look at how we can use these configuration parameters in our application. I have created a simple Spring Boot application which contains main entry point class, and we have an empty application.properties file. Let's say I want to configure some property. Let's say it is app.version, which is 1.0.1, and I want to consume this value and print it somewhere in the application. So in Spring Boot applications, if you want to run anything as soon as the application started, we can create an initializer like this using class app initializer and implement command line runner. We need to implement run method, and let us mark this as Spring component. Okay, so how do we consume this property and print it? So one option is at value and provide app.version, which is the property name, private string app version. So this is how you can bind any property value to any property using this notation, dollar open brace property name close brace. So with this notation, you would be able to bind that value into this variable. Now let us just print this value. App version Okay, let us run and see. Yeah, we are able to get that value and print in the console. Fine, but what if you want to use this same property in multiple classes? Also, what if there is a large number of properties that you want to configure for your application? Sure, you can go ahead and use this add value approach, but there is a better way. We can use a feature called configuration properties, and you can bind these values to an object instead of configuring them all of them to individual properties. Okay, how we can do it? We can create a class called, let's say I want to call it application properties, and I should annotate it with configuration properties, and I should give some common prefix so that all the properties that starts with app dot will be bind to these variables in this class. Let's say I have private string version, and in order to bind these values to this property, we should have setters and getters. Okay, one more thing we need to do is we need to go to our main starting point, a main entry point class, and enable configuration properties and specify the class name, application properties dot class. Nice. So once we have this at enable configuration properties, and you can even specify multiple classes also. You could have many classes like that. So for now we have only one class which contains at configuration properties with prefix app, and we have version property. So what Spring Boot will do, it looks at this app.version prefix and there is a version property. So it is going to match with this, and the version value will bound to this variable. Now let us get that value and then print it here. We can auto-write that application properties as a bean, private application properties, and let us print version properties dot get version. Okay, let us run and see whether we are able to get that value or not. Yes, we are able to get that value. But the best part would be, let's say we have a bunch of related properties. For example, let's say from our application we want to upload or download some files using FTP. For that, we want to configure where is the FTP host, what is the port, username and password. So let us go and configure those properties here. app.ftp.host equals to, let's say, my ftphost.com, and again app.ftp.port equals to, let's say, 50. app.ftp.username equals to admin, app.ftp.password equals to secret. Okay, so now what I want to do is bind all these FTP related properties into a class. So we can create another class called FTP properties or something like that, but usually what I prefer is we can create a static inner class within this application properties itself, class FTP properties, and create those variables, private string host, and port is integer, and we have username and password. The important thing is these property names should be identical to what these values are, but here we need to have this FTP prefix, right? So the way it works is, here at the application properties level we can create private FTP properties FTP, equals to new FTP properties. Okay, so here Spring Boot is going to match with app.ftp.host, app.ftp.port, like that. It's going to map this property chain and then bind the values accordingly. Okay, here if you don't want to provide a setter for this object, you can initialize directly here, but if you are okay to provide a setter, you don't even have to initialize this. Let's say we can just declare that and generate setters and getters for that as well. Okay, cool. And now let us create a toString so that we can print. Here also we need to have setters and getters, and let us have toString. Cool. So now again I'm going back to our main method initializer, and I'm printing all the values just to verify whether we are able to get all the values or not. I'm printing entire properties, which would use this toString method and print everything. Okay, let me rerun this. So here we should be able to see all the values bound. Okay, here we have version. Under FTP properties we have host, port, username and password, all values bound to this object successfully. Nice. For our application, these properties are mandatory. Host is mandatory, username and password are mandatory, and port must be a non-negative number. So these are the conditions we have. But let us see if we just put any negative number and if I don't provide username, and still if I start my application, it's going to start because there is no validation. We are trying to say, okay, username is mandatory field, and if there is no value for it, fail it. We are not saying it right now. So see, here port is bound to this -50 and username is bound to empty value. But we want to fail fast. If the configuration values are not valid, we want to fail fast. So let us see how we can validate our application configuration. To add validation support for the application configuration, let us go to pom.xml, add validation starter, and go to application properties, and let us navigate to FTP properties here, and we can use JavaBean Validation API annotations to add what are the validation we want to apply. Let's say host is not empty, and also username and password should also be not empty, and the port should be a positive number only. Okay, but here, okay, we added the annotations, but if you try to start the application now, it will still start fine. It didn't do the validation because once we add those annotation, we also need to add @validated annotation on the topmost class so that it triggers this validation process. So with @validated added to this application properties class, now when we start the application, it is giving, okay, app.ftp.port value is -50, must be greater than 0, and app.ftp.username must not be empty. So it is failing immediately as soon as it detected that the configuration is not valid. This is what we want. Okay, now we have validation in place, but there is one problem. If we go back to our app initializer and try properties.setVersion, or I can call get FTP and set any value I want. Ideally, our application configuration should be read-only. They are not allowed to be modified. But because we have setters now, it is possible. Maybe it is by mistake or whatever, it is possible to mutate those values. So how do we mitigate this risk? One approach is, instead of using setters, we can use immutable classes with only constructor and getters without any setters. So let us try to change that to use constructor binding. So here we have properties and then we have getters and setters. Okay. Now first thing, let us remove setters. Now we have only getters and make these properties as final and create a constructor. Okay, now we have constructor. And how do we tell them to use constructor instead of setters? We can add at constructor binding annotation. Okay, we need to do the same thing for FTP properties as well. Instead of using setters, okay, let us remove all the setters. Okay, we have removed all the setters. Now we have only getters, and now make all these properties also final. And create a constructor. Cool. So that is sufficient. Now let us run the application. It is failing, saying app.ftp port is invalid. Okay, let us correct these values. Okay, now if we start, yes, these values are bound to this FTP properties also well, and application properties. So yeah, successfully we are able to bind these values into application properties using constructor binding instead of setters. Now the risk of mutating these values are no more because we don't have setters. Properties dot no setter, and we can call get FTP, and again no setters. So there is no option to change these values. Very good improvement. And if you come back to this application properties, IntelliJ is already hinting us, saying that this can be converted to a record. If you are using Java 16 plus, which means Java 16, 17, 18, whatever, you should be able to use record instead of class with the final properties and with the constructor and all these. We can simply use records for the same FTP properties as well. Okay, let us use records instead of that. Okay, ideally we don't need this. Okay, let us remove this toString. We don't need all this. So let me just format this. Okay, we have a record. Nice. And let us do the same for application properties as well. Convert to record. Okay, we don't need this too. Cool. Much concise. We have a record which takes version and FTP, and we have FTP properties record which takes all these values. Okay, now let us check whether we are able to bind these properties into this record, and are we able to get this. Cool. Here we can see version, we can see all FTP properties as well. let us just verify whether validations are also working or not. I just made FTP port to -50, and yes, the validations are also working fine. Cool. So now it is much concise, and we don't have the risk of mutating these values anyway. And one thing to note is, usually when you have setters and getters based access, you usually call get version, things like that. But with records, it is like just property name as a method call, like version. We want to get version, or we want to get FTP dot host, like this. There is no get prefix. So that's all. Cool. So this is how we can configure our application, and we can, if there is only just a couple of properties and it's a small application, yeah, you can go ahead with at value, and that is okay. But if you want to have validations, and also there are a lot of grouping of properties, in our case we have a group of properties related to FTP. So in these kind of cases, it is better to go with this configuration properties approach. And again, one more thing is, when you are using record, I think we don't even need this constructor binding annotation at all. Let us verify now. So now it should fail because we have -50, and if I correct it now, I'm able to see these values correctly. So when you have record, you don't even need that at constructor binding annotation as well. Cool. So that is all for this video. I hope this is useful, and if you have any better ideas about managing the properties, please comment below. Thanks for watching. Bye bye.